Anyway, this simply is not about my wife and I at an Orioles game. It's about Nelson Mandela. And I have all these notes in presenter mode, but we can't figure out how to do it, so I'm just going to wing it, which means a lot of what I say will be based on statistics, but they may be inaccurate as I present them. If I could look at my notes here, I will give you the real deal. But I'll try my hardest. I want to start with a video.
Our fight is against real and not imaginary hardships, or to use the language of the state prosecutor, so-called hardships. South Africa is the richest country in Africa and could be one of the richest countries in the world. But it is a land of extremes and remarkable contrasts. The whites enjoy what may well be the highest standard of living in the world, whilst Africans live in poverty and misery. Poverty goes hand in hand with malnutrition and disease. The incidence of malnutrition and deficiency diseases is very high amongst Africans. The incidence of infant mortality is one of the highest in the world. The lack of human dignity experienced by Africans is the direct result of the policy of white supremacy. White supremacy implies black inferiority. Legislation designed to preserve white supremacy entrenches this notion. I have dedicated my life to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Okay, so what you just heard was the actual audio from Nelson Mandela's 1963 trial for treason in South Africa. The trial was known as the Rivonia trial, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later. But it was that speech that sort of took him from being famous just in South Africa to being a worldwide symbol of the fight against apartheid. Before I begin, I just want to make a quick disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about Nelson Mandela, and I'm going to be talking about South African history, and I'm going to talk about current state of affairs in South Africa and relate that a little bit to America. And I'm not an expert on any of these things. That's really important, the first thing to understand. when Nelson Mandela died December 5th of 2013, we had school the next day, and I was hoping somebody would make an announcement about it, and no one did, so I made an announcement. And then I thought, well, it would be nice if we as a school could sort of pay tribute to Mandela in an official way, given the fact that he's one of, inarguably, the greatest heroes of the 20th century. So that's what I'm going to try to do today, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I'll come back to Ravoni in a second, but when he was giving that speech, this was what he was dressed in. You know, as a lawyer, he usually dressed in a suit and tie and that kind of thing, but he came into court that day dressed in the sort of royal gown of his tribe, and it was symbolic of, he wanted to make sure everybody knew that he was a black man in a white man's court. A super quick bio. I'm just going to like fly through this. He was born in 1918, which means when he died last year, he was 95 years old. In 1944, he formed the Youth League of the African National Congress. In 1948, the National Party took power in South Africa. This is a white political party, and they instituted apartheid. In 1952, he and his partner, Oliver Tambo, started the first black law firm in South Africa. In 1956, he's arrested on treason charges, and he would, for the next 7 years of his life, he would be arrested and put in jail over and over and over again for different alleged crimes. In 1961, he was acquitted on a pretty serious charge of treason, and he went underground at that point because he was tired of being arrested. And while underground, he became commander-in-chief of the military wing of the African National Congress, which at that point was a banned organization. In 1963, he's later arrested when he comes back into the country, and in 1963 he goes on trial, and he gives that speech. It's called the speech from the dock. The dock is where the prisoners or the defendants would stand in the courthouse. And he sort of, a lot of people attribute that speech to be, which by the way was 3 hours long. I only played you 4 minutes of it, but sort of the beginning of democracy in South Africa. He laid out his vision for a democratic South Africa in that speech. He went to prison for the next 27 years, 18 of which was on Robben Island, which is an infamous, it's sort of like Alcatraz of South Africa. It's on an island 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town, and he spent a lot of his days doing hard labor in a prison yard with a sledgehammer breaking up rocks, turning it into gravel. He was sentenced there actually with 9 other leaders of the African National Conference. There were 10 people on trial at that Ravoni trial. In 1985, things were changing a little bit in South Africa, and the president at the time, who was a staunch supporter of apartheid, and for those of you who don't know, apartheid, imagine sort of Jim Crow laws in the American South. Apartheid is like that on steroids. It is a severe form of racial segregation and discrimination meant to give the white minority in South Africa all the power. In 1985, Mandela was offered freedom from prison if he would renounce violence. And he said, no, I'm not going to renounce any means to end the system of apartheid, especially since the white government in South Africa used violence on a daily basis to enforce apartheid, and stayed in jail for another 5 years. But he did begin negotiations in 1985 for his release, and this was secret from the public, but he had been negotiating his release and the transition of the end of apartheid into a democratic rule for 5 years while he was in prison. He would leave prison in the night and go meet with government leaders and have these negotiations. In 1989, a new president of South Africa took over, F.W. de Klerk, and he promised to end apartheid and white rule. Mandela was released in 1990. He was 71 years old at that point. No one had seen him in 27 years. The South African government would not allow him to be photographed in prison. So literally no one in the world knew what he would look like when he came out of prison. So it was kind of a cool thing when everybody got a chance to see him. He immediately began or continued negotiations for a new constitution in South Africa, which would allow everyone the right to vote and participate in the democracy. In '93, he and de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to end apartheid. 1994, they had the first national elections where everyone was allowed to vote in South Africa. Not surprisingly, Mandela's party, the African National Congress, won in an absolute landslide. And he became the first black president of South Africa. 1995, a lot of you probably know about Mandela because of Morgan Freeman and Invictus and Matt Damon. And that was when they had the Rugby World Cup in South Africa. And it's a great story. I'm not going to get into it today, but he threw his support behind the rugby team, which had been a symbol of white supremacy. But he used that as a way to bring the country together, and they went on to win the Rugby World Cup. And in 1999, when you guys were really little, he stepped down as president of South Africa. He had said he only wanted to serve one term. And as you know, in any new democracy, that's a pivotal moment when the first person to take power agrees to give up power. Because that does not happen in the majority of cases. And that original ideal of democracy and fairness disappears with that. But he stepped down in 1999. At the same time, as soon as he retired, he established his Mandela Foundation. Well, the main goal of which was to fight AIDS, which he didn't spend a lot of time on as president and was criticized for that, but he really threw his weight behind that after he retired. And then December 5th of this year, he battled for many months with respiratory infection and finally passed away. So the first thing I want to talk about really quickly is what made him a great man. I mean, anytime we have an assembly about a hero, I think the takeaway is, well, what made them heroic? Right? What can we learn from them? What can we emulate? So what were his character traits and also achievements? The most remarkable thing that Mandela did was transfer power from white rule to anyone can rule, which meant black rule in South Africa without bloodshed. It was assumed by a lot of people in South Africa for a long time that in order for the white reign of power to end, there would have to be a civil war. A lot of people thought that. And it was one of the reasons that whites were so unwilling to give up power, is they assumed they would be massacred if they did. He was able to transition to democracy with almost no bloodshed. He took power without seeking retribution. So he set up a Truth and Reconciliation Committee when a lot of people in his position would have set up a War Crimes Tribunal. So the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was this really amazing thing where everyone came in, black and white, and they put everything on the table. Here are all the crimes that have been committed, all the atrocities that have happened. But instead of prosecuting these people, we're just going to forgive, not forget. That's what the truth part was about, bringing out the truth. But we're going to move on, and move on together rather than dividing. And that took a remarkable person to oversee that kind of thing, because understandably, a lot of people wanted retribution. He was really, really, really empathetic. And that was what made him such a great negotiator, is that he was able to put himself on the other side of the negotiating table. He understood the fears of white South Africans, that if the African National Congress came to power, all their land would be confiscated, their wealth would be confiscated, their lives would be in jeopardy. He understood that and gave them assurances that that would not happen. But he could also empathize with disenfranchised black South African youths who wanted to resort to violence. He could see things from all sides of the table, and that made him a great human being, but also a great politician. He was really flexible. He could accomplish his goals in a variety of situations that started with his childhood when his father passed away, and he became a ward of sort of his tribal state, and he went to various boarding schools, and then he spends 27 years in jail, and next thing you know, he's president. I mean, he had to learn how to accomplish his goals in a variety of settings. He was very humble. He was very humble. He tried really hard not to change when he came to power. As a prisoner, he was always sort of a celebrity among prisoners, and he was offered a lot of privileges that the other prisoners were not. Certain clothes, certain food, certain places to sleep, etc., and he would never take those privileges unless they were extended to the rest of the prisoners. So his humility was remarkable. And then, of course, courage. I mean, that speech at the beginning I showed you, the most famous part of that is at the end when he says, these are ideals which I hope to live for, but which I'm prepared to die for if need be. And that sort of unites him with Gandhi, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it takes that kind of courage and commitment to principles to create change. So here's what I want to do really quickly in the last 4 minutes, I think, that I have. This is sort of where most civil rights assemblies end, whether it's our Martin Luther King assembly or whether you watch President Obama speak at Nelson Mandela's funeral celebration. It always ends this way. You know, today we've taken this time to acknowledge what a wonderful leader this is and how much change they enacted and how different the world is now than it was because of their efforts. But we also acknowledge how far we still have to go. Right? That's how it always ends. We acknowledge how far we still have to go. But no one talks about how far we still have to go. What does that mean? And the reason we don't talk about it is because no one likes, it's uncomfortable to deal with that. So really quickly, and this is just to start a conversation, not to finish it. Uh-oh. I'm jammed up here. Oh, here we go. Let's see. So South Africa. Currently in South Africa, despite all of Nelson Mandela's efforts, and things have improved dramatically, 47% of all South Africans live in poverty. Tens of millions of black South Africans live without electricity, running water, or sanitation. White South Africans, only 9% of the population, still control 70% of the land. And black South Africans continue to earn only a sixth as much as whites. See if the next slide comes up. The situation in America is similar. It's not as extreme as it is in South Africa, but we often, celebrate the civil rights movement and sort of put an end on it in the 1960s, but we still suffer from that legacy of racism and hatred and exclusion today. And a little bit about what was happening the week Mandela died. That made me particularly thoughtful about the where are we now part versus where were we then and what's still to come. That week was an interesting week for me. On Monday of that week, I went to an elementary school called Ashburton Elementary School in Baltimore City to teach a financial literacy lesson. And the week before, I'd been at Antioch Diploma Plus High School in Baltimore City, both city schools. And visiting those two schools, I only saw one other white person the whole time I was there. I saw one white teacher at the elementary school. And that's a sort of jarring thing when that happens. It makes you a little uncomfortable to be in that position, and it makes you think. You look around, and there's no difference in those schools post-Brown versus Board of Education, pre-Brown versus Board of Education. They're still segregated, essentially. Not by law, but de facto. And then later in the week, I was watching my favorite show, the Colbert Report, and he had a guest named Brian Stevenson, who's from Montgomery, Alabama, and runs something called the Equal Justice Project, which he's a lawyer, and it looks at how the justice system in America is skewed against people of color and poor people, both whites and poor people alike. And he threw out some statistics that blew my mind and really made me think about how far we have to go in this country in terms of that stuff. So here, this is the last thing I'll show you. Still in America, non-whites only earn 65% as much as whites. Net worth of white families is 6 times greater than non-whites. Education, these numbers here, of Americans between 18 and 24, 40% of whites are in college, 32% of blacks, 26% of Hispanics. And if you look at who actually graduates, there's an even greater disparity. Health in America. Your life expectancy is impacted by your race. There was an famous article in the Baltimore Sun a few years ago that compared the life expectancy in Roland Park, where we are, versus Holland's Market, which is one of the poorest communities in Baltimore. And there's a 20-year difference in life expectancy. 83 versus 63. 20 years. And this is from Brian Stevenson's presentation. You should watch his TED Talk if you have a chance. It's amazing. A third of all black males in America in their 20s are either in jail, on parole, or on probation. A third. Imagine looking around this room and realizing that one in every three of you is going to end up in jail at some point. It's hard to imagine here, but in a lot of communities, that's reality. Death penalty bias. This is something he talks about a lot. In America, if you're convicted of first-degree murder, you are 10 times more likely to get the death penalty if you're black than you are if you're white, for the same crime. If a black person kills a white person, he is 20 times more likely to get the death penalty than if a white person kills a black person. 20 times more likely, statistically. Same crime, first-degree murder. So, what I'll leave you with is this. One, think about Nelson Mandela and what a hero he was, and I hope you learn a little bit about him, and if you're interested, you'll learn more. But the next is just to have some awareness of how race and inequality and all sorts of categories, sexual orientation, gender, how that affects our chances for success in America. You know, we like to attribute success or lack of success in America purely to personal characteristics, work ethic, drive, virtue, et cetera, and that's important. But there's an environmental factor that has a really large impact on how well you do, what family you're born into, what skin color you're born with. And we need to be aware of that. You can't ignore that. And I hope that what this assembly will do is start some discussion, maybe some research on your part, and hopefully some action, because this country is a long way from being what sometimes we think we are and what we hope to be, which is a place, a land of opportunity where everybody has a fair chance. That's not where we are. And we'll never get there unless we're aware of it and we talk about it. So that's just what I wanted to leave you with today, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.